This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's podcast series. Leading up to the American presidential elections, we're going to have a series of conversations with writers, scholars, activists, and local community leaders about issues that matter to them. I wanted this podcast to be something different. I wanted this to be about a profile and also honoring the remarkable work many in Black, Brown, and working communities do, but also center the issues and policies and the struggles that they have been fighting for a really long time. Joining us today is Anjali Injeti, an Atlanta based award winning writer, teacher, journalist. She's also, her work has appeared in Newsday, The Nation, Guernica, The Paris Review, Al Jazeera, at Atlantic, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. She's also the founder of Desi Blue, an organization that is dedicated, made of South Asian Democrats fighting to flip Georgia blue. Anjali, thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Suchitra, and it's an honor for me.
Thank you. So first, tell us about all the things you do. You're a writer, you're a teacher, you have a new book coming out. So tell us a little bit about all these journeys that has brought you here.
Oh, wow. That's a big question to start with.
I have all the time in the world.
You're very lucky I had my caffeine this morning. It's interesting because I feel like the work isn't even that different, right? I'm a book critic, and it's one of my favorite things to do. But I think criticism and learning how to be a critic and to read between the lines has been a skill that has helped me most when it comes to organizing, right? As you mentioned, so I live in Georgia. I live outside of Atlanta. And a little over a year ago, some friends and I started the Georgia chapter of Desi Blue, which is an organization that started in the Bay Area in 2018. And we are South Asian Democrats who are working to flip seats blue. But as an organizer, I've sort of used my critical literary lens to sort of see what the underlying story is in getting communities to activate and getting communities, out and on the ground, and finding ways to create messaging that both unifies and motivates people to do this work. So I think it sort of served me well. And, of everything I do, of course, writing is my passion, and reading. I love to read. Those are the things that I would do if we weren't probably in such political turmoil. But I will say that reading and writing tend to be very solitary activities. So co-founding the Georgia chapter has sort of given me another community to work with and organize with. And, you're never really alone when you're an organizer. So it's been really good for me. And I feel very nourished in these times, despite how terrible everything is. Being with others who sort of have the same political goals it's given me hope, and it's made me sort of try to push through this really terrible time in the United States right now.
I actually want to jump right into the issues leading up to the presidential election.
Sure.
I know with the presidential election, there's just this constant noise that we are inundated with every day. In that process, there are a lot of issues that matter to smaller communities, especially brown, Black, and working communities, that don't get heard. I feel that way, despite sitting in the heart of New York City. And again, New York seems to have this really energized DSA happening. What do you think are the issues that matter most to your community that is not being addressed the way that you would like to see it addressed?
That's a great question. So it's interesting living in this very red state and often having conversations with you, but a lot of my friends live in New York, California, Massachusetts, it really does sometimes feel like we are in a different country, and our issues are just not seen as much. So Georgia is a state that did not expand Medicaid after the ACA came into effect, which means we have this large group of people who are uninsured, right? They don't qualify for Medicaid, and yet they don't have the kind of employment they need to get insurance through their employer, and yet they also can't get ACA coverage. Okay, so we have this giant gap of people who still really can't get health insurance, and so the narrative about the ACA doesn't apply to this group, and as a result, we have some just really egregious statistics regarding the number of rural hospitals that have shut down. I want to say that number is somewhere around 8 hospitals over the past 5 or 6 years. And if you think about the fact that we are in the midst of a global pandemic, over 6,000 people in Georgia have died from COVID, a disproportionate figure of them from the Black and Latinx communities. When you think about the fact that we don't have Medicaid expansion here in light of a pandemic, it's pretty horrifying. And as a result, even though the number of deaths in Georgia are not anywhere near what they are in New York, for example, one, because our population is certainly much less, but the fact that, a significant number of people in Georgia might have died from COVID because their nearest hospital was 45 minutes to an hour away. It's astounding. Or they fell into that gap because Medicaid wasn't expanded. And along with that goes our extremely high maternal mortality rate, especially among Black mothers. Black mothers die in childbirth here or soon afterwards. These are, in Georgia, we have these statistics about healthcare that sound like they belong to another country, right? What we derogatorily consider third world countries, but they're happening right here in this state. But even aside from healthcare, the act of voting here requires so much forethought and participation. And I mean, that's pretty much all that I'm talking about with members of the South Asian community right now and other Black and brown communities, which is, do you have a voting plan, but not even just a plan A, but like a plan B and a plan C. And we're all sort of, conspiring with one another about, well, are you going to, request an absentee ballot? And then if you don't get it in time, do you sign the affidavit when you go show up in person? And then how do you, it's so complicated, deliberately so, right? I mean, it's not this complicated in other states, but it requires so much time and energy that you feel like, you're spending so much time to exercise a right that so many people fought for, especially in Georgia, which was the heart of the Jim Crow South. And it's just a basic activity, but it's so difficult to even wrap your hand around. I mean, last year, 198,000 voters were purged from the voter rolls here by our Secretary of State, and they were wrongfully purged. This just came out from the ACLU of Georgia. They did an extensive report. So, I mean, just imagine 198,000 people purged, and more so going back several years. Stacey Abrams lost her gubernatorial race. The difference was like 53,000 people. And the majority of people who were purged were Black and brown people, and were young Black and brown people. I mean, when you look at the numbers, you can see that our election process is not working, and it's disenfranchising the same people over and over and over again. I mean, Brian Kemp alone, who is our current governor, but as you know, used to be our Secretary of State, shut down polling locations left and right in rural Georgia. People who did not own cars could not physically get to polling locations. So we have significant issues. And then on the flip side, in Metro Atlanta, where public transportation is more easily available, you have people waiting in line for 5 hours to cast their ballots, and only to find out actually that they're in the wrong polling location, because those change as well at the last minute. And people who vote at the same place for 10 years suddenly find out that they're not supposed to vote at their polling location. So it's really tough to be a Georgia resident right now. Setting aside everything going on with our federal government, we have a double whammy here that really just makes us feel defeated. Now, of course, we also have a wonderful and strong resistance movement here. Black and brown folks who are building coalitions together, and who are convening in online spaces together. And so this is really exciting. But we do feel some days like we are in a different world from our friends in blue states, because we are just fighting to do basic things here. Which is not to say that voter suppression isn't happening in blue states. It absolutely is. But for us, it's really just the entire process of figuring out how to vote, and when to register, feels some days insurmountable to many Black and brown communities.
One of the things I feel that a deeply structurally flawed, oppressive, authoritarian regime does is that it exhausts us, right? The idea is that you're sitting here discussing how to get people from point A to point B, when we sometimes feel like we don't get to have that conversation about the larger ideas. How does one, and this is not something that's new, we've seen this happen over and over. We saw this almost with Bush versus Gore, if anything was going to set the precedent of what's going to happen. What do we do to just not be so exhausted? Because we know the playbook, correct me if I'm wrong, the playbook hasn't changed. Yet you see the other side have a war chest and a unified front. At least that's how it feels from this side of things. What do we do? What do we do in terms of not to try and be exhausted?
So one of the things that I try to do, and what I suggest to others, is to really celebrate every single tiny little victory, to really take a moment to celebrate that. If you are phone banking for a candidate and you get 20 wrong numbers or voicemails or hangups, or you piss somebody off, and then you have one phone call with a voter who is so incredibly grateful you called, who you were able to help show them how to access their sample ballot using our Secretary of State website, or help them request an absentee ballot, or teach them how they can help their 20-year-old register to vote online, or get them to volunteer with your organization. That is a huge victory. And I think we sort of ignore these little victories, right? They don't seem, we want to win an election, right? And so we tend to think of losing that election as like a complete failure. It's never a complete failure. Some of the best kinds of activism and the most number of people have been mobilizing the past 2 years since Stacey Abrams' loss. I mean, It was a terrible loss. It was an unfair loss. She should have won. But it got even more people out on the ground, getting activated in ways that are more productive, right? I'm not talking about texting people memes about how terrible Trump is or, jokes. I'm talking about we are getting people who are making phone calls. Even in my organization, They See Blue Georgia, we are having people this time around make phone calls who had never phone banked before, who had never written a postcard on behalf of a candidate before. We have people who did no any kind of political action who are now going to serve as poll workers at the polls on November 3rd. I mean, these are huge victories. And so we have to see the little pieces that make the whole. We have to cherish them and celebrate them, and then call on them when we have a devastating result later, right? Hopefully that won't be the case this year. But I volunteered for the Jon Ossoff 2017 special election for the 6th Congressional District. I'm a resident of the 6th Congressional District. We were sure that race was stolen. So in recent memory, I had that race turn out badly again. And the results were very suspicious in that race. Then the gubernatorial election in 2018. I mean, I sometimes do want to just lay down and be like, folks, I got to sit this one out. How many times are we going to have these stolen right out from under us? But then I think about all of the coalition building that has been done in the past few years. And the number of people who are so politically engaged now for the right reasons and in the right ways, who I never would have guessed. I mean, some of my friends, they are fabulous. They are introverts, and they are out there making phone calls and text banking. I mean, it's just really been a wonderful thing to see. So we've got to treasure what we accomplish. And we've also have to loosen our standards of what success is in this industry, in this political industry that we're in, because, the small successes really, really matter too. And we can't forget that, even in the midst of a terrible loss.
And I want to talk about, you talked about becoming poll workers, right? So what are the other things, the strategies that we can employ? The way, again, as you said, build community, applying to be a poll worker is one. But what other things can we do? Also, if you can actually, I know that surprisingly, a lot of my friends didn't know that you could apply to be a poll worker. Can you also walk us through that and other things that we can do? As you said, this is not about these elections, it's about building long-term community.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we tried, so I'll answer your first question and then get into the poll worker question. So one of the things that we try to do in They See Blue Georgia is, and They See Blue National does this as well, is to focus on direct political action. So, for example, we try to create spaces that do more than vent about how terrible everything is, and try to encourage people to engage in certain silos of political activity. So our group, we focus on phone banking and text banking, writing postcards to candidates, and becoming either poll workers or poll monitors or watchers, people that can sort of stand outside of polling places, help voters make sure that they're at the right place, notify someone if there might be a possibility of voter intimidation or other kinds of illegal activity, that sort of thing. So that's what we try to do. I've been in a lot of other groups where that's not the focus. And what I find is that it becomes a community of commiseration, which is fine too. We all need folks that we love to nurture us and to commiserate with us. But the sort of nuts and bolts work wasn't getting done. So we try to focus on that. And our group also has, unlike a lot of Democratic groups, our group has a strong social justice lens. So we've been spending a lot of time in our chapter talking about our own anti-Black racism, talking about white supremacy and the ways that we contribute to it. So we've been having those discussions. And in fact, we are reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, for our first book club next month. So those are the things that we try to do, is to one, sort of do the direct political action, and two, really grow our social justice lenses. Because, elections are really just a Band-Aid at the end of the day. They are not addressing the deep underlying systemic issues, right? Voting is not going to solve anything. We know this from the number of police officers who have killed Black people in blue states, right? I mean, this isn't, election is not going to solve that. It's not going to help the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we want to be accomplices for other marginalized groups. So that's what we focus on. But to answer your question about being a poll worker. So it's interesting because I have voted in every single election since I was 18 years old. And I had not once thought about the people who sit behind the tables and who take your ID and help facilitate your right to vote. And until a few years ago, I started thinking, who are these people? How do they get to do this? And then finally this year, I decided to do it. So you can apply to be a poll worker for your county through various ways. In Georgia, you can apply directly through your county. I had actually tried that, but didn't hear back from them. So then I applied a second time through the ACLU of Georgia. They have a poll working program that is very strong. And they also, in addition to help you become a poll worker, they also offer a lot of support. So they have a lot of sort of Zoom sessions to help you understand what the job is. We had a debriefing. So I served as a poll worker for the first time in the August primary runoff. We had a debriefing online afterwards. What issues were there? What do you think you need help with? Was the training adequate? How could we help you train better? And so I feel like for the first time as a poll worker, I'll be doing it again for November 3rd, that I'm actually in the room where it happens, right? Like, this is where it is. And as someone who's written about voting and voting rights these past few years, I think it really has been an enlightening experience to actually do the work myself and see how it goes and see what questions and what difficulties voters have. So I'm looking forward to doing it. I think doing very concrete work like this is a great form of therapy when you feel so much gloom and doom. I think when you have a course of action, it's very healing, it's very nurturing. But I also think it's an analogy, right, to the fact that Brown and Black folks are not necessarily in the rooms where decisions are being made, in the rooms where there's this process that oftentimes feels to us that it's behind closed doors. So I think we need to work ourselves in there. We need to be the insiders instead of always the outsiders. When I was poll working last month, there was an Indian auntie, an elderly woman who had come through and cast her ballot, and she was wearing her sari. And then at the end, she kind of gave me one of those Indian auntie looks, like, "Oh, you're one of us," which was really touching. And then I thought to myself, wow, I'm probably the first South Asian woman that she has seen actually working the polls. And then I had my second thought, which was, I'm the first South Asian woman I've ever seen, or South Asian at all, no matter the gender, that I've ever seen working the polls. And it made me think about how important it is for us to be in those spaces. And we have over 10 people now in our Georgia chapter who are going to be poll workers on November 3rd. I mean, I'm not sure how many South Asian poll workers there have ever been in this entire state. And we are going to be doing that work now. And I think it's so important for us to do that work, to be on the inside and be a part of that process, because what happens is you then talk it up to other people in your community. Oh, I was a poll worker, really? A lot of people don't think of themselves as being able to do the work until they see someone in their own community do it. And then it becomes attainable to them. So I'm really excited, and I encourage anyone and everyone to either be a poll worker or be a poll monitor, but to be there on election day.
I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of anti-Black racism within South Asian communities, including the fact that a lot of South Asian diaspora brings caste with it as it migrates.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly, some of the issues, I was born and raised in India, and I am a new immigrant to this country, which means that some of the things that affect my life is also how issues of Hindutva have now directly affect American elections.
Absolutely.
How you have a war chest of money that's being, this is not just Republicans, it's also how even the Democratic establishment is now deeply influenced by these.
Absolutely.
And while we can talk about Hindutva as a larger phenomenon, again, I'm really would like to learn about the things we can do in our community. I always find that the Bangladeshis have done an incredible job of creating these collectives and fighting.
They sure have. Oh, yes. Absolutely.
But the Indians, I feel, are, I don't know, I feel, I can only speak for the community that I have access to, seem so completely either apathetic, defeatist. I'm not talking about the notable exceptions, or are folks who work in high-paid tech industries or part of the Wall Street, who actually, though publicly present themselves as liberals, actually flirt with ideas of Hindutva. Given these circumstances, what things can we do as a community to change it? And I think that is something I would love to hear from you.
So, Hindu supremacy has been an issue that I started talking about here in Georgia. Hindutva is here in Georgia. And I started talking about it a few years ago here, and how I saw it gaining momentum and power in the U.S. Politics, in Georgia politics. Very few people, very few Indians agreed with me. And now, especially in this race, they are watching their friends and their family members, Hindu Indians, who voted for Clinton in 2016, even voted for Stacey Abrams in 2018, and are now voting for Trump. This is because at the end of the day, the marriage between Hindu supremacy and white supremacy is a very tight one. And eventually, if you really do support Modi and the BJP and the RSS, it becomes untenable for you to be a Democrat. It becomes untenable for you to say that white supremacy is wrong here and that Hindu supremacy is right in India. And we are losing people because of it. But of course, how much can you play to that? How much can you try to appease that? You can't. And I think the Indian American community is starting to have these really tough conversations. They're just starting. We've had a lot of conversations in our group about this. But the issue is that it's very similar, actually, to what happened when Trump was elected in 2016 among white communities, which is, well, I'm upset that my family members voted for Trump, but they're still good people. they're still not racists. They're not xenophobic. They're not anti-gay or anti-trans. They're still good people. So we have that playing out now quite a bit 4 years later in the Hindu Indian community, which is, well, they really think Modi is the best thing for India. The RSS is only about community service, right? They do pour so much money into feeding people. The BJP is not about, it's about India. It's not about, Hindustan, right? So we have these sort of same lies that we tell ourselves now that people were telling themselves about their community members who supported Trump, right? And there's still cognitive dissonance there to a pretty extenuating degree. But we are at least having starting to have very honest conversations about it. I tell people, you're going to have to choose. You are eventually going to have to choose between being against Trump and being for Modi. It's not going to work out for you to believe in civil and human rights in one country and not to believe in it in another country. So you're going to have to choose. And some people, unfortunately, have chosen to then support Trump. And I'm not sure what we can say to them to choose otherwise, because I really think it's just Hindu supremacy that's been there all along that finally rises to the surface enough for them to change their vote. But it is a problem. We are, years behind Bangladeshis, as you mentioned. I mean, I'm so impressed with the organizing happening in that community. We are, years behind in some sense than really any Muslim group, whether they are South Asian based or not. But I do find a lot of people who are really questioning the direction that India is going, questioning casteism, especially with the recent articles about the casteism happening in Silicon Valley, and are really starting to criticize their own communities. This is I've always been very open about sort of how we criticize our own communities. In fact, how we should criticize our own communities and not even bother with anyone else's communities, because we need to fix our own problems first. And I have found many Indian Americans are reluctant to do that. How can you paint Indian Americans with such a broad brush, right? My goodness, my father even says that to me. But I find the more we talk about it, something seeps in. This isn't right. This is hypocritical. How can somebody at the end of the day think that a president here, shouldn't kill 200,000 people from COVID? But then a president, in India can imprison people I think the disconnect is something that more Indian Americans are talking about, especially those that have a history of voting for Democrats. But what I find disturbing and what I think is sort of a barrier for us to change in the Indian American community is Indian American politicians who still play both sides, right? Who are anti-Trump but pro-Modi, and who take money from BJP people here and RSS people here, but then come out, oh, I'm anti-Trump. People who went to Howdy Modi in Houston, and then talk about the Republicans destroying our rights here. I mean, I think that hypocrisy, really needs to come out and needs to be condemned by our community, because we can't do it anymore. And if that means we lose Democratic voters, I'm totally fine with that. Let's find Democratic voters somewhere else. We can't bifurcate civil and human rights and pretend like it counts here and it doesn't count elsewhere. So I'm hoping we continue to have these conversations. I hope they evolve. I hope people draw analogies between, Hindu supremacy and anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and see the similarities and decide that they can't be a part of it anymore.
We are on our 35-minute mark. So as we come to the end of this conversation, what are the takeaways that you want people to do? I know it's less than 40 days now for the presidential election. What can people do? Folks like me, others who might not have the kind of political knowledge and come from communities of organizing. What can all of us do to be helpful and useful for the kind of remarkable work that you and many hundreds of thousands of Americans do every day?
So I think some of the easiest things to do are some of the most overlooked when we are this close to the election. So for one, everyone can check their voter registration to make sure that it's current, and text 10 of their closest friends or family members to also check their voter registration and follow up with them until they've assured you that they have. Okay, so that's one. Two is everyone needs to have a voting plan, meaning how are you going to vote this year? And it can be any number of ways: vote by mail, voting in person early. I do not recommend people voting on election day this year, not just for Georgia, but anywhere. Because when you vote early, if there is an issue, you have time to catch it, right? You have time to fix it. You don't have that kind of option on election day. You do, but it's very hard. So vote early. And again, text, phone call 10 people and ask them to do the same. Come up with a voting plan. Help people figure out how they're going to get to the polling place. What time are you going? Are you taking the day off of work? So that would be number 3. If you are able to take the day off of work on election day, or even go to work most of the day and then end a few hours early, we need people at the polls. We need people standing around so that if there is a long line, you can get food, water, and bring them to the voters. You can get chairs, folding chairs, and bring them to elderly people or disabled people that need to sit down in these long lines. You can use an app on your phone to help people make sure they're actually at the right polling location. So number 3 is definitely, try to be physically at the polling place. Because we have to remember a lot of people can't do it because of COVID, right? They're too much of a risk. So those of us who are healthy, those of us who feel safe and comfortable when we are masked up, those of us should be there. And the fourth thing I would say that people should do, although this is not really an activity, but more of a mindset, is to remember that our jobs are not finished on November 4th, that we will likely not know who president is. We will not know whether we successfully flipped the Senate. Many of us will have runoff elections a month or 6 weeks later. And so the work doesn't end with the vote. And you need to stay as engaged as you were on November 3rd, as you do post November 3rd. Because again, voting alone is not going to fix our democracy. It will help us get on the road to fixing it again. But we have to continue this sort of intense coalition building and organizing and keep that going forward.
Anjali, thank you so much. You can follow Anjali's important work on Twitter. You could also follow the work she does. Of the organization that she founded for the Georgia chapter is Desi. Let me just get it right. I don't want to get it wrong. It is Desi Blue GA on Twitter. Again, Anjali, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. It's been an honor, and thank you for holding such important conversations for the leading up to the election.
No, it's incredibly selfish of me because I just know so many incredible Black and brown women who do this work, and it feels like every one of these conversations is like a political lesson, right? It's like sitting through, learning, also holding each other up. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.